Hello. Today we're looking at Luke chapter 16, the first parable there. Please make sure that you have read and kind of processed through the details of this parable before listening to this. It's going to be really important. I'm not going to lead through every detail of what happens in the parable, so you need to have a good kind of understanding of what's going on before I add some, hopefully, insight into the meaning of the text for us. So make sure you've read it first and are familiar with it. This is a very hard to understand parable. I was tempted just to kind of skip over it a little bit and add it into some other teaching about some of the stuff that comes before or after it, and just kind of not put too much time there. But I remembered that parables are meant to be questioned, and Jesus wants us to ask, what does this mean? In fact, that's what makes us disciples of Jesus, is instead of the crowd, right? We are seeking the Lord for clarity on these things. If we don't seek to understand, we're not any different than all of the crowds around him who heard Jesus speaking in these kind of riddles and they just walked away. So I found this week, as kind of nervous as I was about trying to teach through this passage, that the Lord helped, because I sought it, he helped provide some clarity on this parable. And I'm going to share with you what I've learned. Obviously, my understanding of this parable isn't perfect, but I do believe he's given me some light to shed onto the passage for my sake and for our sake. So let's look at it. I want to define a couple of words that may be unfamiliar to us or we may not be able to see because of our English translation of the text. First, that word shrewd. The dishonest manager is commended for his shrewdness. That's just not a word that I use, so I thought I'd look it up. It just means astute or clever, right? One might even say it means to be smart or wise, right? That word, shrewd, it's used in this parable in a positive way. The manager was commended for his shrewdness. So think of it almost as wisdom. It's a good thing to have. Maybe the most confusing word in the parable is dishonest, or some translations say unrighteous, or some say worldly. It's used a few times starting in verse 8, where it reads in the English Standard Version, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of the world are more shrewd. He goes on to say in verse 9, I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth. It's the same word, dishonest, unrighteous. And then in verses 10 and 11, one who is faithful in a very little is faithful in much, and one who is dishonest or unrighteous or worldly in a very little is also that way with much. If you haven't been faithful with dishonest or unrighteous or worldly wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? So it's the same word. Most translations kind of go back and forth, though, with translating it dishonest and unrighteous, or unrighteous and worldly. And I really appreciate, in this case, the Holman Christian Standard Bible that actually translates that word consistently throughout. So every time you see adikia, every time that Greek word is used, it's translated by the Holman Christian Standard as unrighteous. Okay? Why don't all translations do that? It's not necessarily right that, or always has to be the case that the same Greek word is translated into the same English word, because a lot of times our words have kind of some nuanced meanings, right? Think about the word light. You might say, hey, this room is filled with light. You might say, hey, could you go turn on the light, which in that case you mean lamp, or the switch, the electrical switch. She had light blue eyes means a little bit different nuance there, kind of brighter blue eyes. Or, hey, he saw the light, right, is a spiritual understanding. So it's the same English word, different kind of nuanced meanings. And so it's okay that our translators have done that, but just for simplicity's sake, it's nice what the Holman Christian Standard Bible does in translating that word in this context the same every time as unrighteous. They also do a good job, I think, by translating that word squander, what the unrighteous manager does with his manager's wealth, or his master's wealth. that's the same word as what the prodigal son did. He squandered his father's resources, and it translates it the same there, I think, because there's some similarities in what we see in those two parables. So for our sake, for that word in verses 8 through 12, we're going to use the word worldly, or that's what I'm going to use, is worldly. I think that might be the best kind of consistent way to translate that word, worldly. Could also be unrighteous, could also be dishonest, but worldly, I think, it fits the best to plug it into every one of those situations. Regarding that word, the master commends, this is really important, he commends the manager or the ex-manager for his shrewdness, not for his worldliness. Okay, so the dishonest manager or the worldly manager is just a description of the man. Shrewdness is the reason for the commendation. Okay, do you see that? The master, verse 8, commended the dishonest or worldly manager for his shrewdness. So we're not being told, hey, learn from this guy and be dishonest with people or be unrighteous or worldly with people. We're being told, like the unrighteous guy, be shrewd. Okay, so just to be clear there, he's not being commended for his unrighteousness. And then the last word just to define is wealth. You'll see that in verse 9 all the way through verse 13. That means money. It's mammon, but it's money here on earth, as opposed to riches or something that will last eternally. Okay, and it's the same word when talking about, in verse 9, it says use worldly wealth or money to make friends. It's the very same at the end, and I think we can see the end of this section, what Jesus is putting all together, when it says you cannot serve God and money. It's the same word there. So whether it's translated wealth or money, same word throughout. Just so I think that helps our understanding of the passage. So the part of the parable that we are familiar with, not the spiritual reality, but the part that we can just understand, anybody can understand, is this. There is a way that the people of the world use the money of the world. Maybe dishonestly, but strategically, shrewd people use money for their own benefit. Okay, that is familiar to us. Anybody in the crowds can understand what that means. But there is, for disciples, a deeper spiritual lesson that Jesus wants his disciples to learn. And I would propose that this parable is about how disciples of Jesus are to use the money of the world faithfully or shrewdly. So we can learn things from how worldly people use worldly money, sometimes wisely or shrewdly, but then we expand on that to a spiritual meaning of this parable. Now, I will say this. I know it seems a little odd that Jesus would have us learn a positive lesson from the world. Okay, but it wouldn't be the first time. Even here in our book of Luke, if you remember chapter 11, we saw that even an earthly friend, anybody really, is going to get up and give you food in the middle of the night if you keep pestering them by knocking at their door. Even somebody like that is going to do that. So wouldn't God, who is our friend, provide for us? We also saw in chapter 11, even an earthly father is going to give you what you need. And even more so wouldn't our Heavenly Father. In a couple of chapters from tonight, we're going to read another parable, Luke 18, how an earthly judge gives a woman justice because she keeps bothering him. Listen to how Jesus describes this situation, Luke 18, verse 4. For a while, the judge refused to give this woman justice, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, or he's saying, I'm unrighteous, I'm worldly, he's revealing himself, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she won't beat me down by her continual coming. And the Lord said to her, and the Lord said, and this is verse 6, this is important, hear what the unrighteous or worldly judge says. Listen to them. Then it says, and will not God give justice? Okay, so we're learning lessons, ironically, from unrighteous worldly people. Jesus does that. And Jesus often uses parables of these earthly realities. Okay, yeah, I understand that. Even negatively to teach us about heavenly realities. Okay, so he gives us a concrete example that we can understand to teach us a more kind of abstract spiritual concept. So it goes like this: even unrighteous or dishonest or worldly people do such and such. So how much more should this be the case for the faithful? It's a how much more argument. So if worldly people in this parable in Luke chapter 16 or 16, yeah, if worldly people can be wise with worldly money, so should disciples of Jesus be all the wiser with how they use money. Okay? I think that's what's going on here. So, what do we learn from the worldly manager? And then let's translate that into a spiritual reality. We learn, I think, from this parable, the surface meaning is a shrewd person, even a worldly person, a shrewd person plans ahead with worldly wealth. They're wise with the things that they have. So in this case, the worldly manager says, I'm about to lose my livelihood. I need to do everything I can to secure my future. So he shrewdly lowers everyone's debts so that when his paychecks run out, he'll have other options. Somebody's going to give him a place to live or maybe work. So even worldly people are wise or can be wise to use worldly wealth to prepare for their future. All the more should not disciples of Jesus use worldly wealth to prepare for their future. And listen, the parable isn't just teaching us to be wise like the worldly person for benefit in this life. Be wise with your money, save for your future. Remember, he's teaching us, Jesus is teaching us spiritual realities. One day, the spiritual reality goes, worldly money will no longer exist, right? The paycheck stops. So have we shrewdly prepared for our eternal future? Have we used worldly money for the sake of our eternal home? And this is right in line with many other things Jesus has said already in the gospel. I'll point out too, Luke chapter 12, just a couple chapters ago, Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the needy, provide for yourselves money bags that do not grow old, with a, listen, treasure in the heavens that will not fail, where no thief approaches nor moth destroys. Now, that kind of preparation with worldly wealth would be spiritually shrewd. Another example, Luke chapter 14. Jesus, this was just a few weeks ago we talked about this. Jesus says, when you give a feast, when you spend money, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, spend your money that way, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Again, that is spiritually shrewd. To spend what you have now while you still have it to gain something in the future that you can't lose. And in that last verse about inviting people to the party, that's using worldly wealth quite literally to make friends with the poor and whoever it is, so that when the money doesn't exist anymore, or when it doesn't mean anything anymore in eternity, those friends who have now entered the kingdom because you've invited them into it will be welcoming you into the eternal dwellings. If you are shrewd like that, everyone wins. That's a good, wise, shrewd investment of earthly money. You guys see that? So there's a way that for us to spend our money now that is shrewd and would be commended by our master. And that way is not just for the sake, like in the parable, of earthly houses, but for our eternal dwellings. So do you get that argument there? I'll say it again. If a worldly person spends their money shrewdly for the benefit in this life, then the sons of light, who have a greater perspective, ought to spend their money shrewdly for benefit in the next, because we're aware of that. Okay, Jesus goes on then in verses 10 to 13 to take kind of a slightly different angle about being faithful with money instead of being worldly with money. And it's in that latter section, 10 to 13, where we get kind of a little bit of relief, because even though the worldly manager was right and commended in his shrewdness, he was wrong from the get-go because of his mismanagement of his master's money. So the mismanagement portion here is criticized, which we're like, okay, good, he didn't do everything right. When Jesus talks about being faithful with a very little, he's talking about being faithful with money versus other greater things, much or true riches. You see that in verse 11? So here, being faithful with a little, he's not talking about being faithful with just a little bit of money versus a lot of money, but being faithful with something as little or as insignificant as money in general. And then to be given the opportunity to be faithful with much, it doesn't necessarily mean faithful with more money, but with things that are much more significant than money. And if you can't be faithful with such a little thing as money, then why would God entrust you with more important things? Not to mention, he also here points out, and kind of referring back to the parable, he says that money that you're being faithful with doesn't really belong to you anyway. So right now, we are all managers of God's resources on earth. They don't belong to us. We're to watch over his things in a way that is beneficial really to him, for his purposes. We're to put his interests, he's the master, above our own. Unlike the worldly manager in the parable that was looking after his own interest in that situation. So one day we will have a permanent possession that the Lord gives us, our inheritance of the kingdom. But now it's not our prerogative to squander his resources on ourselves like the dishonest or worldly manager did. So we aren't to follow everything that the dishonest manager did, just his shrewdness on making a decision to use his money wisely for the future. So here are two lessons to be learned from a worldly person. First, positively, like the manager in the parable, be shrewd with money. Think ahead, make friends with it, knowing that there's going to come a time that you won't have it. The spiritual lesson is use temporary worldly wealth to secure eternal reward. That's wise. That's a good investment. And then learn negatively, unlike the manager in the parable, remember whose money it is. And if you want responsibility with great things, then use the master's money for the master's sake. Everything that you have, use for his sake. That's what we learn from the worldly person. And this section ends by kind of asking our hearts, who do you serve? Do you serve God or do you serve money? And Jesus says you can't serve both. Spending money for our eternal future instead of squandering it now, it's really hard, right? Because we have the propensity to be mastered by money. But on the other hand, to treat money, one, as if it can be invested for eternity, where it really counts, and two, as if it now belongs to God, then you're serving God and not money. So we have to think like sons of light, like disciples of Jesus, about how we use money. Money will ultimately fade away, but it's not useless, right? We are to use it wisely or shrewdly. It can be used as a tool now for the sake of God and for his eternal purposes. So will you use money now to serve God, or will you be a slave to money instead?